everybody, it is Amy Stansbury here, Editor-in-Chief of the Austin Common, and today we're going to be talking about the city's new climate equity plan. And this is a plan that a lot of people in the community have been working on for a long time now to try and figure out a way for us to reduce our carbon emissions and also tie that to environmental justice work in our community. So I've got a special guest who's going to be, yes, I'm going to let them in right now. And as we're waiting for them to join, like I said, this is, oh, hey, Kaiba.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing all right. Hopefully my internet connection will do all right as well.
Seems pretty good right now. So yeah, thanks for joining us. I was just going over some of the basics of the climate plan. This is something that City Council is going to be voting on tomorrow at their Thursday City Council meeting. And so I wanted to have you come on and talk some about what this plan is and what it means for our community. So you were involved, were you on the steering committee or one of the committees? Kind of talk about your connection to this plan. Oh, we got a freezing. We'll give it a minute and see if we can get Kaiba back on. Okay, we'll give her another minute or two. Always fun technical stuff with this. Oh, all right, we'll give Kaiba a second to come back on. But as I mentioned, this is something that City Council is going to be voting on tomorrow. And kind of the big headliner of it is that it sets a goal of us having net zero community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, which is 10 years earlier than previous goals that we've had. So it's kind of an amplification in that respect. And then there's a whole bunch of other kind of intermediary goals along with that. And it really is emphasizing trying to reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible, right? Not waiting until the very end. Hey, Kaiba, thanks for coming back on.
Sorry, I knew that my internet connection was going to fail me at the wrong moment. But yeah, to jump right back in, a lot of folks were involved in creating this plan, and it is exciting in a few ways. First of all, from the climate perspective, it does move Austin's climate goal forward in a big way. It will now be set at net zero by 2040, which is 10 years sooner than we have in our current plan. And that is just extremely important. Obviously, we are dealing with a true crisis when it comes to climate change, and we need to get emissions reduced much sooner than 2050. And the goal will also emphasize reducing emissions over the coming decade by 2030, as opposed to just a straight line that treats all reductions over that time equally. It does recognize that in this crisis, we have to reduce emissions now to preserve a livable climate here and around the world.
Yeah.
And the other, yeah.
Go ahead. Keep going.
The other big exciting thing about this plan is that it takes a much broader look at the issue than just reducing emissions, and acknowledges that we must address racial equity and racial inequity in our community in order to be successful in meeting those climate goals. We absolutely have to have participation from the community in order to meet these goals. They are not all things that the city as an entity can control. And the only way that we're going to get those reductions is if individuals and businesses play their part. And that's not to say that we don't need the systemic change. We absolutely do, but we all need to be part of that. And that is very difficult to do, I would say impossible to do, if we don't take the challenge of racial inequity really head on. And I think that this plan moves us a big step forward in that regard.
Yeah. So I want to break down a few of the key things you mentioned. One is just a quick term check for people. So when we say net zero community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, what does that mean? Because that can sound a little wonky, but do you want to just explain what that
Yes,
means?
absolutely. So first of all, net zero does mean that emissions might not actually be zero. But I'll come back to that in a minute. This plan, I think, does a pretty good job of emphasizing the need to actually reduce emissions, not just purchase offsets. But that's what net zero means, is that it does allow for some offsets. And I can talk about that as another wonky term here, too. When we're talking about community-wide, that means that we aren't just talking about emissions from city activities. So we aren't just talking about city buildings or Austin Energy or Austin Water or the city fleet of vehicles. We are talking about all of the emissions that all of us who live and work in this city are responsible for.
So that's
And
like
that's
me at my house, the coffee shop I go to, like all of it.
It's all of it. And in this plan, while the greenhouse gas inventory, which is an accounting of all of our emissions, doesn't account for all of the products that we use, which all have emissions embedded within them because they take energy to produce, it does start to address those emissions by including a section that is focused on reducing consumption. And that is essential if we're actually going to meet our climate goals. So that's another new thing. But to go back to a couple new terms that I threw at you, offsets are simply a way of paying people or entities somewhere else to reduce emissions in lieu of reducing your emissions. And that's generally considered I think, lesser alternative, because when it really comes down to it, we all need to actually get our emissions as close to zero as possible. And that's where I think this plan does a pretty decent job, is that, and it envisions that yes, some offsets may be needed, but that should not be more than 10% in any category. And we know that in some categories, like electricity production, we can truly get to zero. And we're moving in that direction. But it does leave offsets on the table, but it also emphasizes that we should try to use local offsets, projects that are in the Central Texas area or Texas, or zooming out to the United States before we start thinking about any sort of international offset purchases.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about how this plan came to be, because I think that might be something folks don't realize or recognize the work that goes into creating something like this. So you work for Public Citizen Texas, a local, it's I guess a statewide really advocacy organization. Then you do like environmental work and democracy work and consumer rights work, all kinds of things. But I guess you can talk about your role, I guess, like the process that went into this, because is this the second climate plan process you've been involved with at the city?
That's right. This is our second community-wide climate plan, and I have been involved in both of those. And in this case, I think I was a little bit more involved than the first time around, because we have now a body called the Joint Sustainability Committee, which is one of Austin's many advisory commissions. And we worked with the Office of Sustainability and the Equity Office to recruit a diverse set of community members to put this plan together. So we recognized right from the start that this needed to be a little bit different, that it needed to be about equity as well as reducing emissions and taking on the climate crisis. And that's why we brought in the Equity Office specifically to help us make sure that, that wasn't just words on a paper, that it was actually the people involved that are truly representative of the community, and have those connections to bring those kind of diverse viewpoints and lived experiences into this plan.
Right. So I think there was like probably dozens of you all from all different community spaces. So it's not just city staff working on it. You know, you have advocates and community leaders and such. And then, as you mentioned, this time around, something that was different was trying to incorporate more of this equity focus. Can you talk about kind of how this process was different than, we already had a community climate plan in place. I think it was passed maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Then the plan was to update it, on a regular basis. So this is like an update version. But can you talk about what's made this one different?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we had our existing plan. We're on a five-year kind of update cycle. I think one of the big things right off the bat is that we pretty early on in the process, all of the members of the steering committee and the 5 advisory groups or working groups that focused on different subject areas participated in a full day of diversity, equity, inclusion kind of workshop. And so that equity workshop really went through a lot of the history of Austin and the racist history of Austin particularly, and then brought us through into today and policy decisions and encouraging us all to put a different kind of lens on as we looked at those decisions that might seem like they're race neutral on the face, but maybe aren't. And so we all kind of started off with that, at least some common training. Now, I think many of us would say that, we need more than a day on that, certainly, but it was somewhere to start. And from there, we then, collectively on the steering committee decided that we needed some tool to actually make sure that equity was more than just lip service, that it was actually built into this plan. And we created, along with our partners on staff, an equity screening tool. And so all of the goals and strategies in the plan had to go through that tool. And that tool was not intended to necessarily eliminate strategies, but rather to identify where maybe there were weaknesses, where there might be an inequitable outcome from a policy or program that we're envisioning. And if that were the case, then we would go back and look and see, well, okay, how can we adjust this? How can we make this more equitable? Maybe that's changing the strategy. Maybe it's adding a parallel strategy that would reach a different set of people in Austin that have different circumstances of one type or another, perhaps their income, perhaps the type of housing they live in, or the types of transportation that they use. And so that equity tool, I think, is one of the important things that was part of the planning process, but that is also part of the plan and intended to be used throughout implementation.
Yeah, so this is key. I feel like it fits in with a lot of our larger national conversation around Green New Deal or, environmental justice issues. And you do have this danger, I guess, when you think about some of these programs around, just wanting to make sure is it things like that you're not making Austin a whole lot less affordable if you're implementing a program, or you're not driving gentrification. I know there's concern sometimes when new parkland goes in or green space goes in, what that could do to the cost of living in the neighborhood. Obviously it's a great thing. People like parks, but there might be that consequence. Is that kind of the things that are being looked at with this?
Yeah, things like that. And things like, if we're asking people to use different sorts of products or, use recycling and composting instead of, putting trash, waste into the landfill, we need to consider the different kinds of, housing and how that translates to different access to services. And we need to think about, if we're trying to reduce emissions through transportation, what is affordable in terms of vehicles and what kind of vehicles exist in the used vehicle market. It really, anything in this plan, you'll find that there's something to think about when it comes to equity. And that doesn't mean that this plan is the solution to all of our problems. It's not. It's not going to, stop gentrification, or, heal all racial inequity in the city. But the intention is that at the very least, no strategy should make the problem worse. And really, the objective is that each strategy should be doing a little bit to make things better, a little bit to get people better, more equitable access to all of the services that those of us with the most resources in the city already have.
Yeah. I'll just remind folks that are listening, we're talking about the new climate equity plan that City Council is going to be voting on tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can put something in the comments or use the little question feature, and we'll try and answer them as well. I want to talk a little bit about implementation, because that feels like that's a big topic of conversation with any Austin plan. There's always this threat or fear of working really hard on a plan and then it sits on a shelf, right? Or it doesn't go that far. And it seems like this time around, we've had the benefit of Austin is we own our own electric utility. Like, we've made some good progress around climate in certain areas, but it seems like this time around with this iteration of the climate plan, there seems to be more of a focus on implementing it and trying to set up ways that we can measure it a bit better and be more strategic, since we really are in this decade, like you mentioned, where like the work needs to happen now. So can you talk a little bit about kind of like the implementation part of this, or how we're starting to think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think right from the start, although we have the goal for 2040, all the overall kind of goal for 2040, all of the goals within each sector are actually for 2030. And all of the action items, the strategies within, are actually targeted for 2025. Mm-hmm. So we're actually looking at what can we do in the next 5 years, not in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, because we don't have that kind of time to work with. Now, I don't think the plan in and of itself beyond that necessarily solves all of the challenges of implementation, because at the end of the day, implementation is going to rely on a few things. It's going to rely on council action and, the ability and the will of council to change policies and direct new programs to be created or programs to be changed, and frankly, for budgets to be allocated in different ways. And that's a huge thing. How we spend our money as a city will be a large determinant of whether or not we're successful in our climate goals, because in some cases we are spending money on things that actually take us backwards. But the other big thing is that the community needs to be involved. And this plan, one of the things that you will see throughout it is strategies that involve community engagement. Like, most sections of the plan have a specific strategy that is basically community engagement and education and, actual a seat at the table, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Because we're realizing that, with this big gap between what the city can control and what the rest of us are doing, we only can get there if we actually have the community involved. And the city, as much as various departments may have tried in the past, has not yet lived up to that challenge of truly engaging the majority of the community in climate policy, climate actions. And it's not necessarily that people need to show up at City Hall and advocate for a policy change, although they should. That's not something that everybody, is going to be able to do or has to do. But it is about getting information to people in a way that they can understand and relate to, but also in gathering information from people and actually using it. So it's not enough just to ask. You have to actually find a way to look at responses and then do some creative thinking for, well, these people are saying that recycling or composting isn't working for them. How do we take that and make it so that recycling or composting, and those aren't even like necessarily the key elements in the plan. It's just kind of an easy thing that right now people might have on their mind of things that they do. I think as we start to make, as we have made more progress on the things that the city does control, and you mentioned Austin Energy at the start, that has been our big success story in Austin, right? That's where we're actually reducing emissions is in electricity production, because our city-owned utility, as a result of community engagement, has adopted policies to transition to renewable energy. That's great. But that's in a way the easiest possible thing for us to do. It's much easier than, everybody's mode of transportation and, how people are using and what products they're using in their homes and in their businesses. And that's this plan acknowledges that we need to address those things, and that is how implementation, can be successful, is by engaging people in what they're doing and what they're not doing and why they're not doing it, and not shaming because you're not doing it. That's the key. It's not like, well, you're not doing these 5 things, so you're bad, you're wrong, and, we're going to write you off or try to, put you in some sort of anti-climate category. No, it's what aren't you doing and how can we change the structure to make it so that each of us can do more.
Right. And so, I know the plan is broken up into a few different categories and things like that. And we're going to post a recap of the plan broken down early next week for folks to read more about it. And we'll post a link to the full plan so people can take a look. But I just want to give folks like a little bit of a taste or a flavor of like how we start to get to this zero emissions by 2040. Like, energy is an obvious one that we've made great progress in. That's probably where the bulk of our emission reductions already happened. But like, what are other areas or specific policy things that we're looking at? Is it things like creating a place where we have more electric cars in Austin? Is it kind of the way we build homes? Like, what are just some, like, a few examples so people can understand it?
Absolutely. So one example that probably isn't on a lot of folks' mind is refrigerants. Refrigerants are chemicals that are used in refrigerators and also in air conditioning. And when they leak out into the atmosphere, they're actually really powerful greenhouse gases, thousands of times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Thankfully, there's not nearly as much of them as there is of carbon dioxide, but it still actually adds up to a significant amount when it comes to climate change. And really, like, there are solutions. It's that you have to basically capture all of those emissions, and that comes in a lot of, kind of leak detection and repair. So ultimately, we would get to a place where businesses and individuals are, not relying on appliances that are using these, highly polluting substances for refrigeration and for air conditioning. But in the meantime, what we can do is make sure that they're getting repaired right away, and that if there's any sort of demolition of a building or replacement of a system, that it's captured. And a lot of this is in, big kind of commercial, grocery stores, that kind of thing, where they have large refrigeration needs. And this plan does envision setting up some systems and programs to take on those major sources first.
Yeah, totally.
Another, kind of thing that is definitely a big part of this plan, you mentioned electric vehicles and transportation. This plan has 2 sections, actually, that address transportation. One is more general, and it's where you'll find things about, what folks often refer to as mode shift, which is just taking something other than your car, or at least not taking your car alone. Some rideshare could perhaps be considered mode shift, but public transportation, the bus, the train, of course, Cap Metro is doing a lot of work there. But there's a whole nother section of the plan that is just on electrification, on electric vehicles. And I think that this is one of the sections where there's still so much work to be done, not just from the perspective of, getting more electric vehicles out on the roads and getting, fossil fuel internal combustion vehicles off of the road, but in making sure that that's done in an equitable way. And it's a real challenge. Electric vehicles do save money over time, but they cost more upfront. And so how do you get people access to those vehicles and to transportation? And I think that's, kind of one of the tensions in this plan that I think a lot of us have felt is an acknowledgement that even if we would most like to have the main solution be get people out of cars and into public transportation or bikes or walking, there's only so far that we can get with that because there's just, frankly, more people than we can move in those ways given distances that they have to travel and capacities. So there's a lot in there on electrification and how to get more charging stations and how to try to get more access for lower income segments of our community. I don't want to go into too much more detail than that at the moment, but I do encourage people to check out that section in the plan, but I think also engage as implementation rolls around. That's probably one of the sections that we need engagement on the most.
Yeah. You talked about how people can get involved. I want to talk a little bit more about that. I feel like climate is such a big issue, and I think it's something that so many people are super concerned about to the point of, being paralyzed by it, right? Like it's scary and it just feels like nothing can be done and it's anxiety producing. I wonder what advice you have for folks who are passionate about this. Like, where is a place they can start to sink their teeth into and do something? Because I think a benefit of this plan is it does provide like something tangible. Like we have a plan that we can push for over and over, or there's lots of ways, like you mentioned, to plug into it. But I kind of wanted to get your perspective on how people can be engaged on that climate activism locally.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some new opportunities, hopefully, as we move into implementation. But even right now, I think the Joint Sustainability Committee is the community advisory body tasked with currently implementing our Austin Community Climate Plan, but that will transition to the Austin Climate Equity Plan. And there's not a lot of public engagement there, as there isn't at most advisory commissions. And I can understand that. It sounds dry, it sounds boring, but it really is exactly whatever people bring to us. Of course, we are going to be reaching out to staff and getting their briefings and working with staff. But I would love to see that space become more of a monthly climate town hall. We allow, unlimited citizen communication at the start of our meetings and on all of our agenda items. And I think, it would just be a great thing to have people coming and telling us what we should do, what we shouldn't do, how we need to improve things. And staff are there too, and they're listening, and we are working with staff, but I hope that those can become more of a venue for engagement. That said, I think that there will likely be a new implementation advisory body that is more temporary and more focused on budget, which, like I said, I think is critically important. How we spend our money will be a make or break for this plan, as for so many other things. And I encourage folks, again, when that is created, to engage in that. I do think that we need to do more to find other avenues using Speak Up Austin and other tools. One of the things that I was most excited about in this planning process was the creation of the Austin Climate Ambassadors program. This was simply folks who were already in some way engaged in organizing in their communities, getting paid through the Office of Sustainability to have conversations in their communities about climate change and the planning process. And I believe that program is going to continue. And, if you're somebody who's already having those conversations, I encourage you to apply I think that we need more climate ambassadors, and I think it needs to be a full-time thing because it's the most effective way of gathering information and getting people engaged is an actual conversation with a real person that hopefully you already know and trust, or at least is in some way connected to you and your community. And that's what the climate ambassadors are all about.
Yeah, I guess that's getting at this issue that we constantly see in Austin of this tension of who is able to show up and take part in these conversations that are downtown usually and certain hours of the day and exclude a whole bunch of people for all kinds of reasons. So yeah, the Climate Ambassadors Program, great way to be connected as well.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, I say please get involved, but I know that, I mean, even for me, that like, this is my job. And, especially now that I have a kid, like, I get it. Like,
Right.
it is a challenge to go and show up in person at a meeting and, wait and speak your 3 minutes or whatever. I get that it is an extra burden for people and not everybody's going to be able to do that. And that is why, I think we just need more of that, really local kind of neighborhood, community focused engagement that is then connecting back into things like the Joint Sustainability Committee, like the implementation task force or working group that is yet to be created. Because we do need to hear from people, even if that isn't the place they can be.
Yeah, definitely. And from the Austin Common perspective, we'll keep you guys updated about opportunities to get engaged at different levels. So try and figure out things that might take just a few minutes of your time versus a longer time commitment, because I know that everyone has varying degrees of time available to do things like that. I want to mention real quick, someone asked if the broadcast will be available later. Yes, we'll post the recording of this on Instagram and then also on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it. And then they also mentioned bike lane advocacy and things like Kaiba mentioned. I'm sure there's lots of things about bikes in that plan, but I'm sure, if for people who are bike advocates, we also do have as a city a bike advisory council that meets once a month and is really hyper engaged in this and provides some opportunity there. And they're actually, I think they might have just closed the application, but I think they were looking for new members actively. So that's another way to plug in.
But yeah, I mean, bikes and protected bike lanes and, good sidewalk infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure is definitely part of this plan. And I encourage folks to, yes, go to the Bike Advisory Commission. Also, bring those suggestions to the Joint Sustainability Committee. I think if you have the ability to, even if it's just write an email, do it and send it to all that you think might possibly care about it, and hopefully somebody, and I will certainly always be happy to receive emails from the public, will see it, take notice, and try to put it into action. I think, there is starting to be a pretty good acceptance in the city that infrastructure that we have is insufficient. But I also know that, there still hasn't been enough funding allocated to actually address the problem. And that's where I say, the money really does matter, because you just can't repair sidewalks or build bike lanes for free. We have to decide that these things are priorities and put our money where our priorities are.
Yeah. I wanna have Kaiba, maybe if you could give some advice for someone who just said, like, what the intimidation factor of showing up at one of these meetings. Can you talk about what they're kind of like, these committee meetings? And again, not everyone has the availability to show up, but if you are able to show up, any advice for what it's like? Because I think it can be like super anxiety producing to show up to a space you don't know at all and like share your ideas with strangers.
Yeah, it is. And, I hated public speaking when I started this work. I would have hated what I'm doing right now. I got really nervous every time I had to speak in front of city council or anybody anywhere else, even if I had had the same exact conversation with the same people sitting down at a table the day before or an hour before. So it's, I think, just a really natural thing that a lot of people experience. My advice is to do it anyway. And when you do it enough times, you will stop having that reaction. I know that that's not an easy thing, to overcome, but I think you should know that all of the people sitting, behind the dais, as they say, whether that's an advisory commission or city council members, they're all just the same as you. They're just people who live here in Austin and are trying to, by and large, do their civic duty. And they actually really want to hear from you. And they're absolutely not judging if you're a little shaky or if you say a word wrong or if you need to pause for a moment to gather yourself. What I've seen is that actually, like, there's a lot of compassion for that, real kind of human experience as people are trying to share their views and their ideas. So that's not a solution to the feeling that you will feel of, feeling a little anxious and nervous maybe, but do it anyway. And you're going to, I think, be surprised at yourself, because I was one of those people. I did not like doing it, but it was my job and I cared about what I was doing. And so I did it anyway. And I found that it faded away.
Thanks, Kaiba. One last thing then, if people are interested in learning more about the climate plan, things like that, Public Citizen is hosting an event tomorrow. Do you want to talk about that if people are interested in this plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's Public Citizen along with Sierra Club and Poder as well. And it's, just going to be a quick kind of 30, 45 minutes, gather in front of City Hall tomorrow at 5:15. By 5:30, we're going to have a few speakers, folks who are involved in the planning process, and also some council members who have taken this issue in a leadership, role in some way. And yeah, we're there to celebrate this kind of milestone, but also to call attention to the fact that this is really just the start and that we have to implement this plan. Like, I can't say that enough times. We're in a crisis. We cannot put this plan on a shelf and, call it a job well done, because really this is a vision document that, sets a path forward for us, but we have to actually walk down that path. And so if you, have the time and ability to come on down to City Hall at 5:15, you can park in the garage there pretty easy and, come up and show your support. We'll be outside. I do ask, please wear a mask, because we might not, be able to totally social distance. So let's be safe.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I really appreciate it. And like I mentioned, we'll go ahead and post the link to this recording, as well as the climate plan and more information about the event tomorrow, if people are interested in learning more.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate all of your work. Austin Commons is just an awesome resource for the community, and you're doing great things. And I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks. All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.